Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. As you can see from my multiple affiliation, I'm suffering a little bit from bilocality, but that's which is a good thing and interesting, of course, while we talk about the First World War. It enables me to represent both a neutral country and a country that was not so neutral, or at least a country that, notwithstanding its official neutral status, was decisively engaged in the First World War. The First World War had a decisive and lasting impact on Belgium in many ways. As a small country, it played an above-average role in the war efforts, in the war policies of both sides of the conflict. And the war itself had an equally lasting effect on the country. In both respects, the shadows of the past have not ceased to play a crucial role until the present day. As we all know, the German invasion into Belgium finally technically ignited the Great War in Western Europe. On August 4th, 1914, Germany invaded neutral Belgium and Luxembourg as part of the infamous von Schlieffen plan in an attempt to capture Paris as quickly as possible by catching the French off guard by launching a massive attack through neutral territories. The Netherlands were not affected and would finally also remain outside the war theater for the rest of the war years. It was a very clear violation by the German Reich of Belgium's internationally guaranteed status of neutrality that technically caused the British to enter the war. The great powers, including the German Reich, were still bound by the 1839 international agreement to protect Belgium in the event of an unprovoked external aggression. The military effectiveness of the Belgian army is still very much subject to historical debate and controversy. One line of argumentation continues to claim that the resistance of the small Belgian army, and it was already mentioned during the previous talk, around roughly 1/10 of the size of the German army, had been much tougher than expected, holding up at least the German offensive for nearly a month and giving the French and the British forces some time to prepare for the counter-offensives later to come later that year. Another line of argumentation, however, stresses the still very small size of the army, its lagging preparedness, its inappropriate equipment, that's a picture at the very beginning of 1914, ultimately reducing Belgium to a second-rank partner amongst the Allied countries. It was quite clear from the beginning of the hostilities that Belgium had been very poorly prepared for war. Strict neutrality meant that there had been no coordination whatsoever of any kind with anyone. It had a new and unexperienced general staff. It had an unfinished compulsory military service that had been implemented only a few years earlier. Its prime role in Western Europe was to concentrate its military efforts so as to delay the German invasion as long as possible, a strategy that proved in the end not entirely ineffective as it finally disrupted the German timetable. After the start of the invasion, the country was quickly overrun in a couple of weeks, months, overrun by the vastly superior German troops before the winter of the same year as the Allied forces withdrew westwards. Only a very small section, just a few square kilometers, in the most western part of the country remained unoccupied and would become part, of course, the larger western front between the North Sea and the Swiss border. During the years to come, the Belgian section of the Western Front only played a relatively minor role in the German war efforts. The Belgian troops, the Belgian forces, were simply too small to launch a serious counteroffensive, and the Germans themselves had nothing to gain from an attack on that or in that section or in that sector. Belgian military engagement remained relatively limited compared to the huge battles that would rage elsewhere on the Western Front, of course with the major exception of the battles around Ypres. The total of Belgian soldiers actually killed came to roughly about 2% of all eligible young men, not active military, which is relatively low compared to the French figures, the German figures, between 12 and 15%. These figures already give a clear indication of Belgium's relative limited contribution to the combined war efforts by all belligerent parties involved, and largely contradict the glamorous and heroic self-depiction of a small but brave country that had a decisive impact on the outcome of the war. For the duration of the war, the Belgian government went into exile while King Albert I and the Belgian army continued to fight on its section of the Western Front. King Albert I's cooperation with the Allied forces was essentially limited to his main goal of the monarch as commander-in-chief, the liberation of Belgium's territory from the German invaders as soon as possible. Albert refused to engage in any larger-scale military initiative that would exceed his own central political agenda. Close to the Western Front in Western Flanders, many civilians fled the war zones to safer parts of Belgium. In addition to that, and more importantly, hundreds of thousands of refugees from all over the country finally fled occupied Belgium, primarily to the Netherlands, that had stayed out of the war theater, which was neutral to France and to Great Britain. This high visibility of the refugees underscored the role of Belgium in the international public opinion. In the spring of 1915, German authorities started the construction of a lethal electric fence along the Belgian-Dutch border, what would claim the lives of between 2,000 to 3,000 Belgian refugees trying to escape the occupied country. Belgium's contribution to the Great War was probably more of a political and psychological nature than of a purely military nature. The imaginary of a brave little country, brave little Belgium, played a pivotal role in an extensive propaganda war between Germany and the Allied countries. Of course, what remains beyond any doubt and could easily be used was a very essential fact that Belgium had indeed been victimized in an unprovoked attack and was subject to invasion of its territory. What additionally fueled the anti-German war propaganda, however, were the alleged war crimes committed by German troops, particularly during the first weeks of the invasion. The imagining of the rape of Belgium emerged with German army's growing impatience at how Belgium had indeed frustrated the von Schlieffen plan to capture Paris at fast pace. From top to bottom, there was a firm belief that the Belgians had unleashed illegal saboteurs, francs-tireurs, and that civilians had indeed, or the idea was that civilians were engaged in attacking and maltreating German soldiers. The response was a rather massive set of retaliation measures against civilians and the destruction of historic buildings and cultural centers. The German army in September, October, or between August and October, November, finally executed between 2,500 and 6,500, mainly Belgian, but also including some French civilians, between August and November 1914, usually in near-random large-scale shootings of ordinary civilians, mostly ordered by relatively young German officers. Soon after the war, an historian's debate broke out on the content and purposes of the alleged war crimes in Belgium, a debate that has only been partially concluded. During the war, as well as in post-war German revisionist propaganda, the German position was that the widespread sabotage and guerrilla activities by Belgian civilians were wholly illegal and deserved therefore immediate, harsh, collective punishment. Yet, research predominantly conducted by Belgian and other international historians, concluded that German troops had in fact encountered no irregular forces in Belgium during the first 2.5 months of the invasion. The Germans had been responding instead to a phantom fear that they had unconsciously created themselves. What had provoked German ferocious countermeasures was not only the failed blitzkrieg, but more importantly the experiences and memories of French guerrilla attacks and asymmetric warfare during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-1871. Legal Counter-measurements or not, Belgium's allied friends were quick to inform the world about German atrocities. I'm putting German atrocities here in quotation marks, not to question it, but of course it's just as an indication that it's, let's say, that's a part of a particular discourse. Belgian refugees abroad, in the Netherlands, in Great Britain, in France, particularly also in Great Britain, as well as gruesome stories about misbehavior of German soldiers and officers, were major factors impacting and changing public opinion in neutral countries, especially later also in the United States. It would later contribute to the moral underpinning of the American war efforts, particularly once the United States would finally enter the war in April 1917. Britain sponsored the Committee on Alleged German Outrages, known as the Bryce Report. The Germans would respond with their own report on atrocities against German soldiers by Belgian civilians. Later, a substantial part of the anti-German propaganda, mostly highly visualized and with all these gruesome details, proved finally to be highly exaggerated wartime horror propaganda. But what remained largely uncontestable, however, is that Germans indeed had committed large-scale deliberate atrocities in Belgium, a thesis confirmed in the meantime by strong empirical archival research. A critical assessment of Germany's role is a key element in German and Anglophone historical research on the first year on the Western Front. Exemplary is the work of Irish historians Horn and Kramer, who published, I think, in 2000 or 2001, their much-cited study, German Atrocities 1914, a history of denial, in which they exposed the crimes committed by German soldiers. Yet a more recent study by Ulrich Keller, entitled Schuldfrage, so Questions of Guilt, a Belgian underground, I'm translating it now, a Belgian underground war and German revenge in August 1914, recently questioned some of these findings. Historiography has finally determined a total death toll of 906 victims altogether in France and 5,521 in Belgium. The violence against civilians was essentially restricted to the first months of the war, but it did not stop there. Later years of occupation saw additional individual executions and occasional killings, and particularly in the second half of the war, some 2,500 Belgian men would die in forced labor camps in Germany. German atrocities not only included political repression, leading political figures, Belgian politicians and intellectuals being imprisoned and sent to Germany as hostages, but would also include massive material destruction as well. That's a well-known picture showing the almost completely destroyed university library of the city of Leuven, serving as an emblematic icon of German atrocities. Here ends German Kultur. The German atrocities, or let's say the phrasing of German atrocities and the discourse on German atrocities, I'm going a little bit too fast, set a tone of the wartime debate. Yes. German atrocities set a tone of the wartime debate about violence against civilians. They established a distinction between just violence in war against atrocities. Both parties seized the moral high ground by claiming to be fighting a just war against an aggressor who overstepped the boundaries of accepted warfare. The Allied camp, not without justification, against an invader who killed an unarmed people, the Germans, with a bit more stretching of the evidence, against encirclement by enemies whose sneaky methods included civilian sniping. From now on, instances of violence against enemy civilians would be presented in these terms. Both parties accused the other of ignoring international standards for the just conduct of war. The war ended in November 1918, but the foreign occupation would continue to shed long shadows on the political, societal and institutional development of the country for the years and even decades to come, basically until now. The German Reich had attempted to apply a so-called Belgian Politik or Vlamen Politik, a policy regarding the, well, how to treat and how to deal with the Flemish question. Vlaamse politiek, Flemish policy, is a terminology to describe a variety of policies pursued by the German authorities with the explicit aim to divide Belgium into a separate Dutch-speaking Flemish component and a French-speaking Walloon component. For that aim, the long-standing linguistic problems in Belgium were to be exploited, particularly the discrimination against the Dutch or Flemish language that had existed before the First World War. The policy was based on pan-Germanic sensitivities and views on both sides and envisioned the systematic support of the Flemish demands. Fostering separatism in Flanders, that was the idea of the Germans, would lead to the dissolution of Belgium, which was generally seen as a pro-French puppet and frontline state against the German Reich. The Vlaamse politiek was therefore part of a larger ambition to change the geopolitical map of Europe. For that purpose, the Germans sponsored, for instance, the establishment of a unilingual Dutch-speaking university in Ghent, the so-called Von Bissung Universität, Von Bissung University, named after the German general governor of occupied Belgium, but also the introduction of Dutch as the language of instruction in state-supported schools and so forth. 1917, the Raad van Vlaanderen, Council of Flanders, was created a semi-autonomous government in Flanders composed of radical supporters of the German case, finally leading to the proclamation, late 1917, of the independence of the Flemish Republic. With minimum effect, the German defeat in the war would finally torpedo any real consequence. German interference into Flemish politics had definitely split the Flemish movement into a radical, let's say, to a radical branch and into a more moderate branch. Independently, among Belgian soldiers on the Eastern Front, or the Western Front, the Flemish Front movement was formed by Flemish soldiers in the Belgian army who campaigned for better and greater use of the Dutch language. They were not separatists, but they also put this kind of demands on the agenda. All these developments had a decisive impact on political sensitivities and public opinions in Belgium. In the eyes of the large majority in the population that had remained loyal to the Belgian state on both sides of the linguistic border, radical Flemish activists had now finally exposed themselves as national traitors, as puppets in the hands of the German invaders. Radical Flemish nationalists, on the other hand, lost their belief that they would any longer be able to achieve their political goals within the institutional framework of the Belgian state and would soon develop into open advocates of complete separation. It's maybe important also to briefly note that basically the same happened during the Second World War. During the Second World War, Germany pursued a fairly similar policy of favoring the Flemish nationalistic demands. 2 minutes, and the disintegration of the Belgian state. Belgian parliamentary democracy was restored after 1944, but this double German interference into internal Belgian political affairs did not disappear without these remaining traumas. A very deep shift between those people remaining loyal to Belgium and supporters of Flemish independence. It became a split that would ultimately become unbridgeable. It brings me finally to some remarks and considerations on the memories of the Great War. Memories of the Great War continue to live on a very multi-layered context. The 11th of November became the National Remembrance Day, epitomizing the major significance that was given to the Great War as a key moment of historical experience and a decisive turning point in the history of the country. Armistice Day is still today a public holiday with a strong patriotic and military outlook. Its meaning even survived the Second World War, and the 11th of November has not been replaced by a similar Remembrance Day devoted to the end of the Second World War. The narrative around the First World War remains to be phrased in predominantly Belgian nationalistic, military and even, well, de-ideologized terms. The invasion of the country, its heroic resistance and eventual liberation stood at the heart of this national narrative and myth of the First World War. The fate of brave little Belgium feeds the central discourse and memories of World War I in Belgium. War memorials, occasion stones, cemeteries, names given to streets, squares and buildings were erected in almost every Belgian town and village, civilian, parochial and military. National memorial practices with a very still strong emphasis on the role of the monarchy in the army still play an important role today, but emotional identification, I'm trying to speed up, emotional identification gradually declined with the passing of the war and its living memories. And above all, the national narrative is gradually losing its mobilizing effect to create a sense of integration as the context of the Belgian state is changing. Sometimes in sharp contrast to the dominant Belgian national narrative, there's a competing Flemish nationalist discourse, Flemish nationalist counter-narrative. This is the narrative that particularly creates, or that particularly centers around the fate of Flemish soldiers in the trenches of West Flanders. Strong visual symbol of this war and of this war narrative is the Iser or the IJzer Tower in the West Flemish town of Dixmude, a monument that still is one of the central icons of the Flemish movement after the war. Still a symbol of Flemish nationalism, it hosts a yearly political meeting, the IJzer pilgrimage, organized next to the tower. The site also houses a museum on war, peace and Flemish emancipation. The IJzer Tower and its surrounding memorial complex give expression to one of the most intriguing political messages in Europe, and sometimes difficult to understand for outsiders. It combines the messages of pacifism with the rhetoric of Christian nationalism, as epitomized in the central slogan, "No more war," but also "Alles voor Vlaanderen, Vlaanderen voor Christus," everything for Flanders, Flanders for Christ. It's a central icon of Flemish nationalism, until today frequently hosting rallies and meetings, even of the international extreme right. That's a paradox, but that can only be explained by looking at the nature of the Flemish anti-war oratory. It's a pacifism which is missing the link with international pacifism. It's a pacifism particularly informed by the decisive anti-Belgian attitude. Thirdly, the landscape of the former Western Front also hosts many European and international memories of the war. Think of the blood-red poppies, think also of the poem in Flanders Fields. In large parts of the Anglophone and Anglo-Saxon worlds, these poppies became symbol of human loss, of human life loss in the war, and were adopted as a token of remembrance. Equally well known is the famous Menin Gate in the city of Ypres, a monumental triumphal arch dedicated to the many fallen soldiers of Great Britain and the Commonwealth, erected in the 1920s. This is an international, let's say an international memorial landscape, and finally what I would call a transnational memorial landscape. Since the turn of the century, we witnessed the emergence of a new episode in the history of World War I memorialization that builds on this existing international space of memory in the region. No longer adding only by adding national perspectives, but by truly transcending national boundaries, a new transnational historical narrative increasingly gains in importance. For instance, the refurbished In Flanders Fields Museum in the city of Ypres serves as a good example here. The museum explicitly avoids narrow national perspectives and war glorification, but particularly highlights the perspective from below, the concrete conditions of living, surviving, and death, the materiality of daily life in a war zone, and personal narratives. I'm almost finished. We need to give enough time to other speakers. The The larger political framework of the war, and that's interesting, this museum, remains almost completely absent in the exhibition. While the exhibition no longer focuses on the main political and military national actors of the war, it really represents a truly irreversible trend towards a truly post-national historical perspective. There was much more that I wanted to share with you, but you just don't give time.